The sun had not yet climbed above the thick cypress trees when the boy rose from the corner of the small cabin that he shared with a handful of other enslaved children. His limbs were stiff, not from the chill of the Mississippi dawn, but from the work that had begun before most adults even opened their eyes. The smell of wet earth and smoke from distant fires hung in the air, sharp and familiar, and he inhaled it as if it could steel him for the day ahead. Outside, the fields were a muted green, but the household's compound loomed like a silent overseer. Its whitewashed walls glinted faintly in the dim light, a constant reminder of who owned the land and everything upon it. The boy's morning began in silence. No one spoke to him unless necessary. Even greetings were spare and cautious. There was no luxury of childhood here. Play was whispered, fleeting, always in danger of discovery, and innocence was a fragile thing that the plantations systematically stripped away. He had long ago learned that survival required observing everything, speaking only when spoken to, and carrying every burden without complaint. By the time he stepped toward the household, his small frame already bore the weight of countless unspoken lessons. He had learned, almost instinctively, the language of knives, of cleavers and hooks, of the rhythm of meat moving from life to table. This was his education. Others his age were learning letters or trades. He was learning precision, efficiency, and discretion. The master's household demanded perfection, and errors were punished swiftly, sometimes subtly, sometimes with brutality, that left marks visible only for a brief moment before they healed over. Inside the butcher shed, the boy worked under the watchful eye of older men who had been in his position once themselves. They showed him where to hold the knife, how to make a cut that would separate sinew from muscle without wasting anything, how to move quickly but without carelessness. The meat was always fresh, still warm from the field, and it was his hands that made it presentable for the kitchen. The act of transforming living things into sustenance was meant to harden him, and it did, though not in the way his overseers intended. It hardened his patience, his ability to observe, and, eventually, the cold calculation that would serve him later. The boy had a rhythm now, one that was shaped by routine and repetition. He could move through the shed blindfolded and still know exactly where each hook hung, where each cleaver rested, where the blood drained most efficiently. The work demanded focus, and that focus became a refuge. In the act of cutting, he could escape, if only for a few moments, the constant surveillance, the whispered threats, the invisible eyes that measured every twitch of fear or defiance. Yet, skill alone was not enough to shield him. The household had its own ways of testing loyalty and obedience, often through humiliation rather than outright violence. The master's children delighted in subtle cruelty, taking small things, hiding tools, or leaving tasks unfinished so that the blame would fall on the boy. These acts were meant to teach him humility, but they taught something else entirely, that life was measured in small betrayals and that power could be enforced without a single blow. One afternoon, a moment arrived that would linger in his memory far longer than the countless small punishments he had endured. The master's eldest son, a boy nearly his own age but larger, seized him roughly by the arm and shoved him toward the kitchen. Words were exchanged, threats masked as teasing, and the boy's breath caught in his chest. He obeyed, not because he feared the boy as much as he feared the consequences of disobedience. He had been raised in the shadow of authority, and he understood instinctively that the plantation did not reward resistance. In the kitchen, the women of the household were busy with domestic tasks. Their eyes lingered on him for a moment, assessing, but they did not intervene. Intervention was dangerous. The boy's punishment came in the form of ridicule and inconvenience. He was made to carry out tasks that required him to work longer, sweat more, and remain visible under the gaze of everyone who wanted to see him fail. No words were necessary. The humiliation itself was punishment enough. It left him trembling, not from fear of injury, but from the awareness of his own vulnerability and from the realization that even skill could not protect him from the unpredictable cruelty of those who wielded power over him. That night, in the dim glow of a single lantern in the cabin, he replayed the day over and over in his mind. The humiliation, the small failures imposed upon him, and the way the adults and children watched silently, each observing the hierarchy without speaking of it aloud. He began to see patterns. Where others saw only labor and obedience, he began to notice weakness, carelessness, and the inconsistencies that marked the overseer and household members alike. These observations, subtle as they were, became his private education, a blueprint for understanding the fragile architecture of control. In the quiet hours before sleep, the boy imagined the tools he handled during the day, not as implements of work, but as extensions of his own body. Each knife, each cleaver, each hook was not simply a tool, but a key, a lever in a system that had always been imposed on him. He traced the contours of their edges in his mind, imagined the weight of their steel in his grip, and began to see himself not as a passive participant in the plantation's machinery, but as someone capable of moving through it with purpose. The following days continued in the same rhythm, but the boy's perception had shifted imperceptibly. He observed the household's routines, not just to avoid punishment, but to understand where it faltered. The master's children grew careless in their pranks. The adults became complacent in their authority. Small moments of negligence, the placement of a knife slightly off its hook, a door left ajar, the misalignment of the cleaver on the table, did not escape his attention. These were not opportunities for rebellion yet, but they were lessons, and lessons accumulated. The older enslaved men in the shed noticed the change as well. They had trained him to survive, to follow orders, to perform. Now they observed him calculating, absorbing, anticipating. They offered no advice, because advice was dangerous. What mattered was that he was learning, and learning with a precision that did not need guidance. One evening, the boy was sent to clean the tools after a long day's work. The shed was silent except for the scrape of a blade against wood and the faint drip of water. He moved slowly, deliberately, knowing that every motion was noted by invisible eyes. A sense of quiet power settled over him in those moments, the first time he recognized that skill, patience, and observation could create an inner fortress impervious to casual cruelty. It was a revelation both terrifying and exhilarating. That night, as he lay on his cot, he reflected on the accumulation of small injuries, the humiliation, the isolation, the constant reminders of his place. They had done their work thoroughly, but in the process they had taught him more than they intend. Dead, they had taught him patience, calculation, and a profound understanding of human frailty. In his mind, he began to piece together not just how the household functioned, but how it could be undone if ever necessity demanded. The boy was not yet ready to act. He did not know if he ever would. But the first seed had been planted, a recognition that the tools of his labor could be wielded in ways the masters never intended. It was a dangerous thought, one that could have cost him everything if discovered, but it was also empowering in a way that mere obedience could never be. Days turned into weeks, and the plantation continued to operate with its usual rhythm. The boy performed his duties flawlessly, earning the grudging respect of some overseers while remaining invisible to the master's children. But beneath the surface, a subtle tension built. He no longer moved purely out of fear. His mind worked continuously, mapping, measuring, memorizing. He understood that knowledge, patience, and silence were now as powerful as the sharpest blade. By the time the sun began to set one late summer evening, the boy had become something the plantation could not see clearly. To the master and his family, he was still a tool, a child too small and unimportant to be a threat, but in reality he had begun the first stages of transformation, from a passive victim of circumstance into someone who understood the fragility of authority and the consequences of its abuse. Session 1 of the boy's story closes not with action but with awareness. He is still bound by chains, still under the scrutiny of a world designed to erase him. Yet within that world, a quiet, deadly knowledge has taken root. The tools, the routines, and the cruelties of the household have become his teachers, and he has begun to learn lessons the masters never intended him to know. In silence, in observation, and in the unassuming work of a boy raised among knives, the first chapter of what would become the most terrifying story the Mississippi plantation had ever seen is quietly, inexorably written. The days that followed were shaped by repetition, but repetition no longer lulled the boy into mindless compliance. Every motion, every gesture, every glance carried significance. The kitchen, the shed, the corridors of the household became a landscape of observation. Each space held patterns, each routine a rhythm he memorized with a precision that startled even the older men who had trained him. The work itself, the cleaning, the cutting, the preparation, remained unchanged, but the boy's attention had shifted. He no longer existed merely to serve. He existed to witness, to catalogue, to understand. The household remained unaware of the transformation taking place in the quietest corners of its domain. The master continued to issue orders with the assumption that obedience was automatic. The children pranced through the halls, their laughter punctuating the silence of servitude with sharp, careless energy. The older servants went about their tasks, absorbed in survival, rarely pausing to notice that the boy's mind was no longer on survival alone. He measured them, counted their patterns, and began to see the vulnerabilities they would never admit existed. Hunger became a constant companion, but not the simple hunger of the body. It was a hunger of mind, a gnawing need to understand how power worked, how authority could be imposed, and more importantly, how it could be broken. The master's cruelty had been systematic, sometimes direct in the form of lashings or verbal tirades, sometimes indirect through neglect and deprivation. Each infraction, each punishment, each humiliation left invisible marks that the boy absorbed like ink on skin, permanent and indelible. He began to notice the inconsistencies. The master demanded perfection from some, yet overlooked the same failings in others. Orders were enforced with arbitrary severity, creating a map of fear and expectation that could be anticipated. The children's antics, the overseer's blind spots, the servants' hesitations, every small detail was a thread in a pattern. He traced these threads in his mind with relentless focus, understanding that the same knowledge that bound him could eventually be wielded to unbind others. Isolation, which had once been a source of fear, became a tool. In the quiet hours, when the others had gone to sleep or were busy with chores, he would sit alone and reconstruct the day. He imagined the paths of people, the timing of their movements, the places where doors were left unlocked or weapons unattended. The boy's imagination, once limited by the fear of discovery, now expanded into a blueprint of potential action. Each evening became an exercise in strategy, a rehearsal in precision, a silent meditation on the consequences of observation. The older men who had taught him the trade of the knife began to sense the change. They watched him not with suspicion, but with a quiet, wary respect. He had learned the work well enough, but now he was learning the world itself. They offered no guidance, for advice could expose both teacher and student to danger. What mattered was that he was thinking, anticipating, and understanding the unspoken rules that governed life and death in the plantation. Knowledge, they knew, was as sharp as any blade. The overseer grew restless. He noticed that the boy's eyes lingered longer than they should, that his hands moved with deliberate intent, that he seemed more present than required. Authority, which had always been unchallenged, suddenly felt uneasy in the boy's presence. The overseer increased his scrutiny, demanding speed, precision, and attention, unaware that each examination revealed more than it concealed. The boy adapted to this surveillance, learning its rhythms, predicting its intrusions, and using them to refine his own understanding of the environment. Night brought a different kind of learning. The plantation settled into silence, a deceptive calm that encouraged observation. The boy listened to the sounds of life around him, the creak of floorboards, the distant barking of dogs, the subtle shift of horses in the stables. Each sound carried information. He began to understand the vulnerabilities hidden within the household's apparent order, the placement of tools, the timing of patrols, the separation of the guards. All became pieces of a puzzle that he committed to memory. In these hours, he also learned about patience. Patience was not simply waiting, it was a form of discipline that required the suppression of instinct, the control of desire, and the anticipation of opportunity. Every day's labor became a rehearsal in endurance, every humiliation a lesson in restraint. The plantation believed it was shaping him, but in reality, it was training him for something else entirely, a deep, quiet understanding of the fragility of imposed power. The boy's attention extended beyond the household. He observed the land itself, noticing hidden paths, overlooked gates, and blind spots in the plantation's defenses. He catalogued escape routes, unlikely as they were, and calculated the timing of patrols. He did not yet act on these observations, but the knowledge accumulated like tinder ready for a spark. The plantation believed it had contained him, but in truth he was already moving in ways invisible to the masters and overseers alike. As the days grew longer, the boy's understanding of fear shifted. Fear had once been a constant, shaping every motion and every choice. Now it was a tool, so meaning to observe and manipulate in others. He saw how easily panic could spread, how quickly authority faltered when confronted with unpredictability. He watched the overseer bark orders, seeing the cracks in his confidence widen with each misstep. He noticed the servants whispering, exchanging glances that betrayed the system's vulnerability. These observations were lessons that would later prove invaluable. Physical endurance remained essential. The work was brutal, demanding both strength and precision. Yet the boy moved with a quiet efficiency that disguised the mental labor beneath. His small frame masked a growing awareness, a consciousness that measured not just tasks but opportunities. The mastery of physical skill and the comprehension of the environment merged, creating a kind of silent power that went unnoticed by those around him. Even meals became exercises in observation. He noted who ate first, who was given more, who went hungry. He listened to conversations, recording patterns, inflections, and hidden meanings. Gossip, once dismissed as trivial, became a source of insight into the weaknesses and fears of the household. The boy catalogued everything, not for revenge yet, but for understanding, recognizing that knowledge was a weapon, even sharper than the knives he wielded daily. In the late evenings, when the household settled into routine exhaustion, he sometimes imagined scenarios where the power dynamics were reversed. He did not act on these thoughts. Imagination was safer than action. But he rehearsed silently, understanding the consequences, weighing risks, and considering the leverage that even a single unnoticed moment could provide. The boy was learning that power could be disrupted without force through patience, timing, and precision. The overseer's increasing attention became a source of both danger and opportunity. Every close observation, every attempt to assert dominance, revealed more about the man than the overseer realized. The boy catalogued gestures, habits, and weaknesses. He learned that authority depended on compliance, and when compliance faltered, the structure began to crumble. The plantation believed it held him in place, but in reality, he was already observing the cracks. By the end of several weeks, the boy had transformed in ways invisible to the household. To outsiders, he remained a small, obedient child, performing the grueling labor of the butcher shed without complaint. But inside, he had constructed a map of the household, a web of vulnerabilities, and an understanding of the human psyche shaped by cruelty and fear. He was no longer a passive participant. He was a student of power, endurance, and observation. The plantation's confidence in its own order remained intact, a fragile illusion. Orders were given, tasks completed, and appearances maintained. Yet beneath the surface, the seeds of disruption had been sown. The boy's mind, once consumed by fear and survival, now contained strategy, patience, and a measured understanding of consequence. He had learned that knowledge, when combined with skill, could shift the balance of power in ways the masters could never anticipate. Session 2 closes with preparation. Not for immediate action, but for the slow accumulation of understanding that precedes it. The boy is no longer merely enduring, he is learning. Every routine, every observation, every unremarkable day has become part of a larger design, one that the plantation cannot see, and one that will, in time, alter the course of everything around him. What began as survival has become mastery, and mastery, unlike fear, cannot be contained. The night was unusually still for a Mississippi summer. Cicadas hummed in the thick trees surrounding the plantation, but their song fade. LT muted, almost reverent, as if the land itself was aware that something was about to change. The boy had worked through the day as he always did, his hands steady, his movements precise. The heat pressed down on him, a reminder of the unrelenting demands of labor, but also a cloak of invisibility. The household had grown complacent. They assumed that routine had made him predictable. They were wrong. He had observed them for months now, cataloguing each habitual gesture, each lapse in attention. The master had been drinking that evening, his voice loud and careless, carrying through the halls and into the yard. The children ran and shouted, oblivious to the tension that their small bodies could never fully perceive. The servants moved dutifully, their movements automatic, each step in its expected place. Every person in the household contributed, without knowing it, to the pattern the boy had been tracing, the fragile architecture of control he had come to understand. He lingered in the shadows of the kitchen, a place he knew better than anyone. The knives hung just so on the racks, the cleavers balanced carefully, the hooks positioned for optimal use. He had learned their weight, their balance, their lethal potential. This was not just labor anymore, it was preparation, study, rehearsal. Every day he refined the memory of each tool in his mind, turning routine into readiness, awareness into latent power. The plantation had trained him to be precise, to obey without question, to endure without complaint. Now he was taking that training and shaping it for purposes the masters could not imagine. The opportunity came almost by accident. The master's eldest son had insisted on a late-night game of hiding and seeking in the great house, a foolish indulgence fueled by arrogance and too much wine. He ran carelessly down the corridors, shouting for his sisters, leaving doors open, leaving paths unguarded. The overseer, himself a creature of routine, had retreated to his quarters to drink in solitude, unaware that the boy was watching every lapse. The household was blind in its comfort, and the boy had learned that vulnerability was always exposed when power grew careless. He moved quietly, each step measured, each sound minimized. The kitchen was his domain, the pantry was familiar, the servants' quarters were predictable. He passed through the hallways like a shadow, unseen yet aware of every eye that might glance in his direction. He had learned to anticipate attention and deflect it. For months, he had been rehearsing this moment in his mind, cataloguing every failure, every oversight of the household that could be exploited. The night was his, and yet it had not yet arrived. The master stumbled through the hall, drunken laughter echoing off the walls. The children followed, unaware of the danger they invited by leaving rooms unlatched and doors ajar. The boy waited until the perfect moment, when the attention of all potential witnesses was diverted, and moved with the precision he had learned in the butcher shed. Each motion was deliberate, controlled, and almost invisible. There was no hesitation, no fear-driven mistake, only the cold certainty of practice. The act itself unfolded with terrifying clarity. It was not chaotic, not frenzied, not the uncontrolled eruption that outsiders might expect from a child. It was calculated, a series of deliberate movements shaped by observation and patience. The boy moved through the house with a knowledge that had been accumulating for months, exploiting weaknesses that no one had thought important. The household, trained to see him as powerless, was blind to the precision of his timing, the efficiency of his actions. Shouts rang out suddenly, fractured by confusion and fear. The children screamed when they understood, too late, that the routines they had taken for granted offered no protection. The master's voice, once commanding, cracked with panic and disbelief. The overseer, roused too late, tried to intervene, but the boy had already accounted for his presence. Every contingency had been anticipated. He moved with a calm that belied his years, with an awareness that transformed fear into strategic action. By dawn, the household was in chaos. Neighbors would later speak of the silence that fell over the plantation afterward, a silence more profound than any absence of sound. The boy had done what no one thought possible. He had turned the instruments of labor, the knowledge of routines, and the vulnerabilities of those in power into something irreversible. The plantation's world had fractured, and the cost of understanding the fragility of authority had been paid in blood. The aftermath was immediate and pervasive. Word spread rapidly, carried on horseback and whispered in the quarters of the enslaved. Some spoke of the boy as a monster, others as a spectre of vengeance long overdue. But among those who lived under the constant weight of oppression, his actions were seen differently. He had shattered the illusion that power was absolute, that cruelty could be exercised without consequence. The boy had become a symbol, a living testament to the dangers of underestimating those rendered invisible by societal hierarchies. Men arrived from neighboring plantations, bearing weapons and authority, expecting to restore order. They searched the grounds, questioned surviving members of the household, and attempted to reconstruct the events. But the boy had anticipated their arrival. He had already disappeared into the swampy outskirts of the plantation, moving through paths he had memorized, unseen and unfollowed, every exit, every hidden route, every bi. ND Spot had been committed to memory. The land that had once been a prison now offered him sanctuary. As he moved deeper into the forested swamps, he reflected not on the act itself, but on the preparation that had led to it. Every moment of observation, every day of repetition, every humiliation endured had contributed to this outcome. Fear had been transformed into clarity, pain into calculation, invisibility into power. The boy's survival depended not on strength alone, but on understanding, patience, and the exploitation of predictable behavior in others. In the swamps, he encountered other enslaved people who had fled before him. Some whispered of the events at the plantation. Fear and admiration mingled in their voices. They offered food, shelter, and guidance. The boy moved cautiously, aware that trust was a currency as fragile as any weapon. Yet he learned from them as well, absorbing knowledge about the land, about navigation, about the dangers and resources of the wilderness. The swamp became both shield and classroom, expanding his understanding of survival and strategy. Time in the swamps was measured not in hours or days, but in lessons. He learned to track, to anticipate, to remain invisible while observing those who sought him. Every sound became significant, every movement a potential threat or opportunity. Months passed, and the boy grew into something older, sharper, more aware. His small stature remained, but his mind and instincts had developed in ways that few could comprehend. He had become a student of power in all its forms, human, environmental, and psychological. Rumors began to spread beyond the swamps. Stories of a boy who had destroyed a plantation household circulated among nearby towns, some exaggerating his actions into legend. Officials dispatched search parties, offering rewards for capture. Hunters and slave catchers scoured the FO. Rests, but they could not find him. The boy had become more than flesh and blood. He had become a shadow, a cautionary tale, and a symbol of the consequences of cruelty. Despite the danger, he did not act recklessly. He understood the need for patience, for observation, for timing. He could have confronted the plantation directly, sought revenge on those who had wronged him, but he realized that immediate action carried risk and offered little advantage. Instead, he focused on survival, on understanding the world that had once enslaved him, and on learning how to turn that knowledge into long-term power. His mind, sharpened by months of study and reflection, began to imagine possibilities beyond mere survival. He thought of the plantation not as a single location, but as a network of power, vulnerable and flawed. He considered how fear, secrecy, and miscalculation could be used to influence outcomes without direct confrontation. Every lesson learned in chains, every moment of observation in silence, became part of a larger strategy. By the time the boy emerged months later into a community of free and fugitive people, he had transformed entirely. He was no longer a child defined by the cruelty of the plantation. He had become an agent of his own destiny, shaped by trauma, but not defined by it. Knowledge, patience, and awareness had made him formidable in ways that brute strength alone could never have accomplished. The plantation, and those who survived its devastation, would remember him in stories and rumors for generations. They could describe the chaos, the fear, the impossible precision of his actions, but they could never truly comprehend the mental rigor, the observation, and the patience that had made it possible. To them, it was an inexplicable act. To him, it had been inevitable, a culmination of years of preparation and insight. Session 3 closes on. the threshold between the boy's world of survival and the new world he is about to enter. The Mississippi swamps, the networks of the enslaved, and the knowledge of human weakness all lie before him, shaping a future in which he is no longer merely a victim. The night has fallen, the plantation is in ruins, and the boy, forged by cruelty and sharpened by observation, moves forward with a deliberate, almost mythic precision. What comes next is uncertain, but the pattern of patience, calculation, and quiet power has been set, and it will continue to guide him as he steps into legend. The boy had disappeared into the swamps and forests of Mississippi, leaving behind the broken walls of a household that had never truly seen him, never understood the intelligence that had grown in silence. Days became weeks, weeks stretched into months, and still he moved unseen, guided by the intimate knowledge of the land he had cultivated while trapped under the master's gaze. Each tree, each bend in the river, each hidden path became a marker, a waypoint in a geography only he could read. The swamps, with their shifting waters and hidden dangers, became a fortress, a place where the boy could exist beyond the reach of those who had imposed tyranny upon him. Word of his disappearance spread quickly, carried by frightened witnesses and the whispers of the enslaved who had survived the night of destruction. The plantation owners sent messengers, then mounted patrols, and finally a small militia, all of them convinced that brute force would bring him back under control. Yet the boy had learned the rhythms of people as well as the rhythms of the land. He moved in ways that anticipated pursuit, understanding instinctively the blind spots of those who relied on fear to enforce obedience. Each attempt to capture him failed, not through luck, but through meticulous preparation and patient observation. In the wilderness, he encountered others who had fled the chains of plantations. They were wary at first, strangers with stories of survival as brutal as his own, yet he approached them with caution, recognizing that trust was a currency more precious than food or water. Over time he learned from them, adding knowledge of hunting, navigation, and stealth to the understanding of human behavior he had cultivated since childhood. Every skill, every lesson, every careful observation built upon the last, transforming a boy raised among knives into something far more formidable, a figure capable of existing beyond the law, beyond fear, and beyond the reach of those who once dominated him. The landscape became a stage for his quiet strategy. Swollen rivers, dense thickets, and treacherous marshes that had once trapped him now offered concealment and opportunity. He understood how sound traveled over water, how the wind carried scent, and how the movements of wildlife could camouflage human passage. The boy, no longer merely a boy, became a master of perception, aware that the world measured his every motion and yet could never fully anticipate it. The Mississippi wilderness was both protector and teacher, revealing secrets to those who paid attention. Rumors of his deeds began to take on a life of their own. Stories of a boy who had destroyed an entire household and vanished into the wilderness spread from plantation to plantation. Some whispered that he moved like a shadow, that no guard could approach without losing track of him, that he could strike unseen and disappear before a scream could reach the ears of the frightened. Others exaggerated the tale further, attributing supernatural cunning to his escape, suggesting he had allies in the trees, in the rivers, even in the spirits that haunted the swamps. Among the enslaved, he became both warning and inspirat. Ion, a symbol that the system that bound them could be subverted. Despite the myths, the boy remained deliberate, careful, and entirely human. He avoided unnecessary risk, understood the value of patience, and recognized the fragile nature of the advantage he possessed. Each day, he moved with purpose, not recklessly but methodically, understanding that his survival depended on observation, timing, and discretion. The militia that scoured the swamps, the hunters who followed tracks into thick brush, the informants who searched for any hint of his presence, all were unable to locate him, and each failure only reinforced his knowledge of human limitation. The plantation, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile the events of that night with their assumptions about control. They had trained obedience into their enslaved laborers, believed in the absolute authority of fear, and assumed that any challenge could be suppressed with violence. But the boy's disappearance shattered that illusion. Neighbors whispered, some in disbelief, some with awe. The household's survivors were haunted, each recalling the moments they had overlooked, the small errors in judgment that had allowed a child to seize control in a way they could never have imagined. Their fear became an inheritance, passed down to all who remained, a constant reminder that authority was fragile when confronted by ingenuity and resolve. In the wilderness, the boy began to experiment with new identities. He moved between communities of fugitive enslaved people, adopting names, stories, and appearances that masked his true history. He learned the art of blending in, of becoming part of a collective while remaining apart, observing, learning, and preparing. He understood that power could be exercised quietly, invisibly, through presence and perception rather than through force alone. The world beyond the plantation offered both danger and freedom, and he navigated it with the precision that had first been honed in the butcher shed and reinforced through months of calculated observation. He also began to understand the psychological impact of his legend. Stories of the boy who had destroyed his household and vanished began to circulate in towns and counties beyond Mississippi. People spoke in hushed tones, embellishing details, attributing intelligence and cunning far beyond what they could witness. The boy had become more than a person. He was an idea, a manifestation of the consequences of cruelty and complacency. Wherever his story traveled, it forced consideration of what happens when those deemed powerless act decisively. The panic his legend inspired was a weapon in itself, one that required no presence, no confrontation, only the lingering memory of fear. Yet he did not allow myth to define him. He remained attentive, grounded, and deliberate. Every decision, every movement, every choice was measured against necessity and survival. He had learned to be patient, to let others reveal their weaknesses, to wait for the precise moment to act if action became necessary. Knowledge of human behavior, observation of patterns, and mastery of the environment had become his most reliable allies. In the swamp and forest, he was both hidden and in command, aware of the fragility of the structures around him and prepared to navigate them with calculated precision. Months turned into years, and the boy, now a young man, had transformed completely. He was no longer defined by the brutality of his upbringing, though it had shaped him. He carried the lessons of fear, patience, observation, and survival as tools. His existence in the wilderness allowed him to consolidate knowledge, build networks, and refine strategies that would enable him to act with discretion, influence, and occasionally decisive intervention. The Mississippi landscape, once a prison, had become a classroom, training ground, and shield. He became a figure of whispered legend. Plantation owners warned their children about the boy who had defied authority, hunters spoke of his uncanny ability to evade capture, and the enslaved shared his story as both inspiration and caution. Tales evolved, some placing him as a spectral figure in the swamps, others describing him as a man who could strike with precision and vanish before anyone could respond. The truth was quieter, more deliberate. He survived because he understood the principles of observation, patience, and human weakness, and he exercised them with a calculated calm that no one could anticipate. Yet there was also a deep solitude in his life. The boy, now a man, understood the cost of his independence. He could never return to the world he had left behind. He could never reclaim the childhood, the innocence, or the family that had been stolen from him. His freedom was forged in isolation, in careful planning, and in the memory of every slight, every act of cruelty, every lesson learned in silence. Solitude became both his companion and his teacher, forcing him to rely on his own judgment and instincts, while observing the world around him with constant vigilance. As he moved through the swamps and forests, he began to recognize the moral and psychological legacy of his actions. The destruction of the household, the subversion of authority, and his escape had changed the dynamics of power across the region. Fear spread among the planters, caution among the overseers, and a sense of possibility among the enslaved. His story, though hidden from formal records or public acknowledgement, became a living narrative of resistance, survival, and the consequences of cruelty left unchecked. The young man also began to consider the long-term Implications of his survival. Knowledge alone was power, but knowledge combined with patience, strategy, and discretion could influence events far beyond his immediate control. He observed trade routes, human settlements, and the movement of patrols, understanding that he could manipulate perception without risking confrontation. The boy who had once been trained to follow orders had become a master of observation, capable of acting decisively only when opportunity and timing converged perfectly. Time passed, and the story of the boy who had destroyed the household became legend across Mississippi and beyond. Some said he had disappeared into the swamps permanently, a phantom impossible to track. Others claimed he had joined communities of escaped enslaved people, becoming a leader, a guide, a teacher, and a symbol. All accounts agreed on one point: he had exploited the weaknesses of his oppressors, turned knowledge into power, and vanished in a way that defied capture. The man who emerged from the boy's experience had become an embodiment of survival, patience, and strategic intelligence, a cautionary tale for the powerful and a source of inspiration for the oppressed. By the time the authorities ceased organized searches, the young man had already forged a network of safety, information, and influence that ensured his continued survival. He had learned that freedom was not merely the absence of chains, but the mastery of environment, perception, and knowledge. Every step he took, every path he followed, every person he met was part of a careful strategy to remain unseen yet influential, to exist beyond the reach of those who believed themselves all-powerful. The plantation and the surrounding communities would forever be haunted by the memory of that night, a memory distorted, exaggerated, and mythologized over time. But for the young man, the significance lay not in the stories others told, but in the lessons he carried forward: the fragility of authority, the power of patience, the importance of observation, and the transformative force of knowledge. Survival, he had learned, was not a passive state. It was an active, deliberate practice, a combination of awareness, strategy, and the courage to act when opportunity aligned with preparation. In the end, the boy who had been trained among knives became a figure whose legend would outlast the memory of his captors. He demonstrated that intelligence, patience, and careful observation could overturn systems of cruelty, that the underestimated could achieve outcomes beyond the imagination of the powerful, and that survival itself could be transformed into agency. His story, though obscured by myth and time, remained a testament to the indomitable human spirit in the face of systematic oppression. The young man's tale is a stark reminder of the consequences of cruelty, neglect, and the underestimation of those society deems powerless. It is a story that transcends the specific events of a single plantation and challenges us to reflect on the human capacity for resilience, strategy, and survival in the face of overwhelming oppression. It reminds us that history is shaped not only by those in power, but also by those who endure, observe, and ultimately act. Thank you for following this story. This has Benusa Buried Stories, where we uncover the hidden narratives that history tried to bury. If this episode captured your attention, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with those who care about uncovering the truths of the past. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every story you want to discuss. Stay connected with us and reach out for more untold tales, because the past is never truly gone, and together we can ensure that forgotten histories are remembered and honored.